London calling in the home, overseas, and European services of the BBC and through United Nations Radio Mediterranean. And this is John Snagg speaking. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, have just issued communique number 1, and in a few seconds I will read it to you. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. I repeat that communique. Communique number 1. under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
Andromaque se parfume à la lavande.
Athalie est restée en extase. Nous disons 2 fois Athalie est restée en extase.
J'aime les chats siamois. Clémentine peut se curer les dents. Grand-mère mange nos bonbons. Il est temps de cueillir des tomates. Il n'y a plus de tabac dans la tabatière. Je n'aime pas les crêpes Suzette.
Ici Londres. Veuillez écouter maintenant quelques messages personnels. L'éléphant est caché une défense. Nous répétons, l'éléphant est caché une défense.
Le cheval bleu se promène sur l'horizon. Les girafes ne portent pas de faux col.
Pierrot ressemble à son grand-père.
Louis a 2 cochons.
Tante Amélie fait du vélo en short. Les sanglots des violons de l'automne bercent mon cœur d'une langueur monotone.
Good evening, everybody. Tonight's communique just in from invasion headquarters summarizes the news of all the successful landings. Allied forces, it says, have succeeded in their initial landings in France, and fighting continues. The communique goes on with air action, saying that all day Allied planes continued their bombing of what the dispatch calls very great strength. Another bulletin states that a German counterattack is in the making. It says the first German counterattack is likely to materialize within the next 48 hours. And another bulletin just in emphasizes the element of surprise, saying that the Nazis were caught off their guard in an effective surprise by the Allied forces. Well, the news pictures Allied troops massing in the streets of the Norman city of Caen. That place is 9.5 miles away. It represents a drive that far from the beachheads established early this morning. The Germans tell us the landing forces are broadening and strengthening their position, getting incessant reinforcements. New masses of troops, new tons of armament pouring ashore. Caen is at the base of the Norman Peninsula, which thrusts northward into the English Channel, and the drive to the town makes it look as if the strategy were to cut across the base of that peninsula and force a Nazi withdrawal from the whole area. The possession of that peninsula would mean a powerful base from which Allied thrusts could be driven inland, probably in the direction of Paris. To the British troops in the Second Front forces, that town of Caen represents historic memories. That is, if they have time to think about it. For it was there in the river that William the Conqueror in 1066 assembled his fleet with which he invaded Britain, the Norman conquest, and the mortal remains of the conqueror lie interned in the church of Saint Etienne in the city of Caen. The latest advices from both sides, allied and enemy, picture the invasion as concentrated at 3 points: the mouth of the Orne River, where Caen lies, and 40 miles westward along the coast, the mouth of the Veer River. That point is the base of the peninsula, and the Germans report that the Allied troops have cut an important highway still further along. Nazi accounts tell us that there have been landings also in the area between Boulogne and Calais. The Dover Straits cross the narrowest width of water from Britain. The German radio is quoted as saying that Allied airborne troops have seized a flying field in that sector, although there is no Allied confirmation of this so far. It so happens that the coastal battlefield is one of the most familiar stretches of ground on this earth. The French Channel shore from Cherbourg to Le Havre, for many years one of the commonest routes of travel for American tourists visiting Europe. They often landed at Cherbourg, and then the railroad to Paris took them along the coastal lanes. I myself have made that railroad trip many a time, and have seen the coast from the water side. Flat country, only slight rises of ground from the beaches. Cherbourg itself on a tall, rugged headland, a strongly fortified harbor just below. And around Calais and Dieppe, there are cliffs, like those white cliffs of Dover right across the channel. But in between the Calais-Dieppe area and Cherbourg, the beaches are broad and flat, and the level ground is head-on. A water-level route to Paris. And so, any of the thousands of travelers who have made the railroad trip will appreciate the statement in the invasion news coming in that the most favorable stretch of coast was selected for the second front landings today. The events of today were studded with records, too. The greatest fleet of ships ever to set sail. 4,000 ships and thousands of lesser craft. The greatest army ever to strike a hostile shore. That vast force of men and machines, tens of thousands of men increasing to hundreds of thousands, millions before it is over. And the greatest air assault ever delivered. Before the day began in the hours of darkness between midnight and dawn, thousands of British planes hurled more than 5,000 tons of bombs on the Nazi fortifications. Then more than 1,000 American heavy bombers took up the assault, and soon the total tonnage of bombs was more than 11,000. The British air officer remarks that the total tonnage of bombs dropped in this one day of invasion was greater than the amount the Germans hurled on Britain during the entire 6 months of the Great Blitz. The most colorful news of the day concerns the Patriots. Those airborne forces were struck behind the Nazi Atlantic walls in advance of the landing of the seaborne soldiers. A United Press correspondent who witnessed invasion scenes from the coast of England described the sky as looking like what he calls a Christmas tree with colored lights strung out in long lines. These, he goes on, were the running lights of the planes carrying airborne troops. The lights were to identify them to anti-aircraft batteries in Britain. Wave after wave of these airborne fleets, he relates, passed over the coast in a steady stream, their colored lights beaming and finally vanishing as they disappeared over the channel in the direction of France. In that first wave of paratroopers in an outfit which reminds you of American history of times gone by. Indians, yes, Indians, wearing their tribal scalp locks. They restrained their tribal war hoop, however, while descending silently, parachuting to earth. Then all of their ancestral stealth was needed when they got down, as they spread out over the country today. Their job needed the stealth of the braves of times gone by. These Indians, landing in France today, were Yaqui and Cherokee tribesmen. They were devilish engineers whose task it was to sneak in and blow up enemy installations. One of the paratroopers who jumped today was Robert Hillman of Hartford, Connecticut, who felt in a special sense of security. The story, by the way, inspired me by an old friend, Ted Shane of the Black Watch, author of a book called Heroes of the Pacific. Shane tells how recently Private Hillman said to a colonel at inspection, "I know my ship is okay because my mother checked it. She works in the Pioneer Parachute Company in our town, and her job is giving the final once-over to all the chutes." Prime Minister Winston Churchill's formal report on May Day was given in tones of measured optimism in 2 statements to the House of Commons, the second of which recited the progress of events up to mid-afternoon. Sober and factual tones made his disclosures all the more encouraging. This operation, said Winston Churchill to the Commons, is proceeding in a highly satisfactory manner. Then he went on, many dangers and difficulties which last night seemed to be extremely formidable are behind us. Passage in the sea, he explained, has been made with far less loss than we apprehended. And he went on to say that the bristling batteries of Nazi guns across the channel had been greatly weakened by air bombing and the fire of naval artillery. Churchill emphasized in these words, landings and follow-ups are proceeding with very much less loss than we expected. However, Churchill went on with his usual note of realistic caution. All this, he said, although a very favorable and vitally essential first step, cannot indicate what may be the course of battle in the next few weeks, because the enemy will endeavor to concentrate in this area. And in that event, heavy fighting, said Churchill, will soon begin and will continue without any end so long as the enemy can push troops in. This is, however, he concluded, the most serious time, and we enter upon it with our great allies, all in good heart and good friendship. President Roosevelt this afternoon added his own warning against overconfidence. He pointed out that it is one thing to land successfully on enemy beaches, and another to drive the long, hard miles to the heart of the enemy country. The President said that the decision to launch today's blow was made last December at the Churchill-Stalin-Roosevelt Conference in Tehran. It was then decided that the Second Front would get underway toward the end of May or the first days of June. No exact date could be fixed, because that depended on accidents of weather. The President added that he himself had known the exact date, Tuesday, June 6, 1944, only during these past few days. So he knew it last night when he was on the radio. The President says that while he was on the air making his broadcast concerning the fall of Rome, he was aware that the invasion boats already were on their way to cross the English Channel. One of the tense turns of drama was enacted today in a motor trailer under a tent somewhere along the southern coast. The trailer, headquarters of General Ike Eisenhower. From this, he will direct the onslaught until the Allied command crosses the channel and sets up headquarters on French soil. So early this morning, there was the ruddy face, ordinarily smiling Eisenhower. But he was tense now, in a moment of this great decision. It was for him to give the order, the hurling of the second front. Was this the time? Should he set the whole vast offensive into operation? That was the question of weather. It had been noticed that during the past 48 hours, the usual Eisenhower posture had been head propped up, looking at the sky. D-Day had been scheduled for yesterday, but no. It did not take one of those Eisenhower looks at the sky to see that the weather was bad, stormy, bad for flying, impossible for parachute operation, the channel too rough for the efficient handling of boats. The general's glances upward were a quest for signs of clearing, harbingers of better weather. What were the prospects for today? Eisenhower and the top-ranking commanders studied the weather reports, the weatherman being the real commander-in-chief for the declaration of D-Day. The meteorological reports turned out to be good enough, but the weather today was by no means perfect. Not too good for bombing fleets of the sky, though these did a huge and devastating task. The channel was quiet yesterday, though still choppy. That turbulent strait, whose seasickness-producing antics are a legend. For the airborne assault, the question of weather was the most critical of all. Things have got to be just right for dropping paratroopers in the dim break between darkness and dawn. Well, all of these chances were a weighty burden of the mind of the commanding general who had to decide, go ahead or delay again. Eisenhower has ample heart and courage for making a decision, and he gave the fateful order. D-Day. Surely he had enough to occupy the mind of any one man, enough to monopolize every thought. And yet I wonder whether his fancy did not stray at least for a little moment to this side of the ocean. I wonder, did he stop and think for a moment of that tall bluff on the broad river, with the height crowned by stately buildings? Did he think of West Point, his wife and his son? For it's a moody coincidence that this invasion day Eisenhower marked down in history was also graduation day at West Point. His son John was one of the graduating students. His mother was there to see him get his diploma, while his father was over there, commanding on the air. Soviet Russia's invasion news was announced with all the military fanfare and the proclamation of a great Red Army victory. Today's Moscow dispatch tells us that the Russian people exploded with an outburst of joy greater than they usually accord their own triumphs. Everywhere in Moscow the hope was expressed that the war would end quickly now. The Red Army seemed about to do its own large bit toward that happy consummation. The word is tonight that the Russians will launch another big offensive of their own within 24 or 48 hours, almost certainly before the end of this week. The second front to be supported by a new big push on the first front. As for the war in Italy, of course it's eclipsed by the much greater events along the English Channel. We may note, however, that yesterday's action still continued. The Fifth Army driving rapidly forward, with the Germans in full retreat. For a brief while, the battlefront was along the historic Tiber, from Rome to the sea. With only the briefest pause, British and American troops were across the Tiber, which for all its venerable reputation is no great stream, according to American standards. From the river, the advance pushed on along a 17-mile front, and so much for it. Well, the nation here at home today took the D-Day news with a feeling of earnestness and hope. Everywhere people were soberly repeating the exclamation of a sergeant as his boat pushed off in that dim light this morning. They can't stop us. So said the sergeant. Any other amusement feature was shut down today because of the feeling that it wasn't appropriate to use expression. Typical was a Marine Corps sergeant at Hollywood in the early hours of the morning. He had just won a jitterbugging contest at the nightclub, and he was here. Then he heard the news and said sheepishly, "I feel a sort of thing." One of the oddities is the fact that at Reno, that wide-open Nevada town, the gambling houses closed down today. Across the land, there were demonstrations of patriotism. At Philadelphia, the Liberty Bell rang, that symbol of American freedom. and in numberless churches the bells pealed out, calling for the prayer. Over in England, the appeal to divine providence, led by the King, the prayer concluded with a solemn theme. We shall not ask that God may do our will, but that we may be enabled to do the will of God. And in this country, the President leads the nation in prayer tonight in the countrywide broadcast. Meanwhile, let's switch to Washington now to hear a voice to speak an appeal with singular appropriation. Chaplain Brigadier General William R. Arthur, Chief of the Chaplains of the United States Army.
Almighty and eternal God, and we thy humble servants are on our knees this fateful day to adore thee and to implore thy help. Thou who knowest the weakness and the frailty of our nation, hast shown us through the sufferings and sacrifice of thy beloved Son how to be brave and strong and victorious. As our fathers, sons, and brothers on distant battlefields fight valiantly for our liberty, for thy truth and justice, graciously shed the light of thy countenance upon them, and sustain them with the power of thine unconquerable will. Send angels to thy heavenly host, on to glorious victory, for thy honor and glory. Amen.
And on that solemn note, we conclude one of the greatest days in the history of man, a day meant to mark the turning point of the global war. In years to come, the world and its history will tell again and again of this day, June 6th, D-Day, Invasion Day. And so long until tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Thomas. This is the National Broadcasting Union.
We take you now to Hollywood, but we bring you Ronald Colman with an exclusive feature in the NBC presentation of the events which are shaping history this day. Now, Mr. Colman.
Especially for this broadcast over NBC, Miss Edna St. Vincent Millay has written a poem and prayer for an invading army. They must not go alone into that burning building which today is all of Europe. Say that you were with them, spirit and heart and mind. Although the body, grown too old to fight a young man's war, or wounded too deeply under the healed and whitened scars of earlier battles, must remain behind. You too may not be with them, save in spirit. You, so greatly needed here in the very van in front of duty, to fashion tools and engines, and to engineer their transports, build the ships and mine the coal, without which all their efforts would be worse than vain. You, men and women, working in the workshops, working on the farms, makers of tools and of engines, fitters of wings to metal birds which have not left the nest, which yet must try their flight, sowers of seed in season, and planters of little plants at intervals, on acres newly plowed and disked and harrowed to feed a starving world. You workers in the shipyards, building ships which crowd each other down the way, you miners of coal in dark and dangerous corridors, who see the sun total eclipse each morning, disappearing, as you do, under the earth's rim, not to emerge into the daylight until the day is over and the lights dim. All you, without whose constant effort and whose skill, without whose loyal and unfailing aid, our men would stand stranded upon a foreign and a hostile shore, without so much as a stout stick to beat away death or pain. Bullets like angry hornets, buzzing round the ears and the bewildered brain. And from the sky again and yet again the downpour of heavy, evil, accurate, murderous rain. Stood behind them through this hour. Move strong from behind them now. Let's still the weary bones encase the indefatigable will. But how can men draw near so fierce a conflagration? Even here, Across a grey and cold and foggy sea, its heat is felt. Why, touch your cheek. Is it not hot and tight and dry? And look what light climbs up the eastern sky and sinks and climbs again. Like to the bright aurora of the north, it floods and flashes, pulses and echoes, then glows, lighting the entire east majestically, as if it were the sun that rose. I wish it were. Surely our fibre and sinew, the backbone and brain of us, are made of some less common stuff than clay. Surely the blood which warms the veins of heroes at the front, our brothers and our sons, runs also in our own. And are we not then capable, perhaps, of something more courageous than we yet have shown? Surely some talisman, some token of our lofty pride in them, our heavy gratitude, and so much love will find its way to them? Some messenger, the vicar and the angels of what we feel, will fly before them where they fly, before them and above, like patron goddesses in wars of old, cleaving with level lovely brows the hard air before the eager prows, lighting their way with incandescent wings and winged heel. This is the hour. This is the appointed time. The sound of the clock falls awful on our ears, as the sound of the bells, their metal clang and chime, tolling for those about to die. For we know well they will not all come home to lie in summer on the beaches. And yet, weep not, you mothers of young men, their wives, their sweethearts, all who love them well. Fear not the tolling of the solemn bell. It does not prophesy, and it cannot foretell. It only can record. And it records today the passing of a most uncivil age, which had its elements, but lived too well and far too long, and which on history's page will be found guilty of injustice and brave wrong. O thou Prince of Peace, this is a prayer for war. Yet not a war of man against his fellow man. Say rather, Lord, we do beseech thy guidance and thy help in exorcising from the mind of man, where she has made her nest, a hideous and most fertile beast. And this to bring about with all dispatch, for look, for even now she would lie down again to whelp. Lord God of hosts, thou Lord of hosts not only, not alone of battling armies, Lord and King, but of the childlike heart as well, which longs to put away, oh, not the childish, but the adult, circuitous and adroit, antique and violent thing called war, and sing the beauties of this late to come, but oh, so lovely spring. To see where our young men go forth in mighty numbers, to set free from torture and from every jeopardy things that are dear to thee. Keep in thy loving care, we pray, those of our fighting men whose happy fortune it may be to come back home again after the war is over, and all those who must perforce remain, mourned, valiant slain. This we beseech thee, Lord. And now, before we rise from you, one thing more. Soften our hard and angry hearts. Make us ashamed of doing what we do, beneath thy very eyes, knowing it does displease thee. Make us more humble, Lord, for we are proud without sufficient reason. Let our necks be bowed more often to thy will. For well we know what deeds find favor in thy sight, and still we do not do them. O Lord, all through the night, all through the day, keep watch over our brave and dear, so far away. Make us more worthy of their valor and thy love. Let them come home. Oh, let the battle, Lord, the grief and and let our boys come home. So cries the heart, sick for relief from its anxiety, and seeking to forestall a certain and a greater grief. So cries the heart aloud, but the thoughtful mind has something of its own to say. On that day, when they come home from very far away, and further than you think, for each of them has stood upon the very brink, or sat and waited in the anteroom of death, expecting every moment to be called by name. Now, look you to this matter well, that they upon returning shall not find, seated at their own tables, at the head perhaps of the long festive board, trinked out in prodigal array, the very monster which they sallied forth to conquer and to quell, and left behind for dead. Let us forget such words and all they mean, as hatred, bitterness, rancor, greed, intolerance, bigotry. Let us renew our faith and pledge to man his right to be himself and free. Say that the victory is ours. Then say, and each must search his heart in true humility. Lord, Father, who are we that we should wield so great a weapon for the right and rehabilitation of thy creature, man? Lo, from all corners of the earth we ask, all great and noble to come forth, converge upon this errand, in this task, with generous and gigantic plans. Hold high this torch who will, lift up this sword who can.
You have heard Ronald Coleman in a poem and prayer for an invading army, written especially for this broadcast by Miss Edna St. Vincent Millay. This first reading of the poem was an exclusive feature in the NBC presentation of the world-shaking events of the day. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
Having canceled all regularly scheduled programs, NBC invites you to listen tonight at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Wartime, half an hour from now, over most of these stations, to Fibber McGee and Molly in a special Invasion Day program. Tune in then and all evening long to NBC for complete invasion news coverage. Well, D-Day is here. The culmination of 2 years of military planning and home front production was reached this morning when the first G.I. Joe and his United Nations allies took their step onto the sandy beaches of France's Normandy coast. The nation wakened this morning to a slow consciousness that this was it, then went to pray and to work. To pray that the liberation of tortured Europe would be speedy and that our country's sons might be spared as much as possible. It was a day of work and of prayer and of hope. National Broadcasting Company canceled all its scheduled programs so that news of the invasions could be flashed coast to coast without a second's delay. All day long, people stayed by their radios and read their newspapers. But it is not really until tonight that America's thoughts on D-Day are crystallized. So now NBC will switch to its affiliated stations from Hartford, Connecticut to Oklahoma City so that this United Nation of the United Nations may see how common is our purpose and how strong is our unity. In this special half-hour cross-country swing of America, we will also include the latest bulletins from the invasion front as they develop. Here is one which has just been handed to me. From New York, the Brazzaville radio, as heard by NBC monitors, claims that General Dwight D. Eisenhower has set up his headquarters in northern France. The Free French station asserts that Eisenhower's staff includes 4 famous French marshals. This broadcast was monitored in New York. Brazzaville says, when questioned about these reports, Allied official sources are said to have described them as slightly premature. But the Free French radio continues to broadcast the story of General Eisenhower setting up headquarters in northern France. The news of our landings on the continent reached New York an hour this morning when only night shift workers, radio station and newspaper people and fireflies were abroad. But there was no hilarity, no celebration in Times Square. New York's Mayor LaGuardia set the theme for Manhattan's D-Day observance when he called the City Hall employees into his office at noon for prayer. It was not an island. It was part of the closely knit United States, which had seen H-Hour and D-Day come, and which was determined to see V-Day, the day of final victory, come, and come, God willing, as soon as the determination, work, skill, and fight of 130 million people, plus their good friends and fighting allies could bring. Now for the reaction from the heart first of New England's vast industrial section to D-Day, we take you now to WTIC Hartford.
What is the reaction of Connecticut to the invasion? Here at a WTIC microphone to give the answer is Eugene E. Wilson, Vice Chairman of the United Aircraft Corporation, Chairman of the Connecticut War Finance Committee, and Chairman of the Aeronautical Chamber of Commerce of America. Mr. Wilson.
In Hartford and Connecticut, the reaction was immediate and vigorous. We did not wait for June 12th. In Connecticut, we launched the Fifth War Loan with the invasion. We moved with the troops of General Eisenhower. Through the press and radio, we passed the word along to every town and hamlet. We began about 3:30 this morning, and soon our War Finance Committees went into action. The Fifth War Loan was underway even before workers on the night shifts had left their lathes and benches in our great war plants. When a few hours later our men and women daytime workers left their homes for the factories, thousands of them carried our Fifth War Loan battle cry, "We moved with the troops." During the hours that followed, there was a tremendous and spontaneous reaction to get busy to buy war bonds. In 3 hours this morning, the giant whistle on the Scoville manufacturing plant in Waterbury had blown 10 times. Each blast announced that another Scoville worker had bought a $1,000 Fifth War Loan bond. In the town of Ansonia, a high school boy was late for school this morning. He was late because he stopped along the way to sell war bonds, $600 in Fifth War Loan bonds. Thousands of people reacted to our battle cry, "We move with the troops," and bought bonds in a surge that resembled the buying avalanche that followed Pearl Harbor. The General Electric Company plant in Norfolk, Connecticut, by early afternoon, the workers had topped their quota and immediately pledged to double it. As the people of Connecticut caught the spirit of this fateful day, more and more thousands of them came into possession of war bonds dated July 6, 1944. It seemed as though everyone wanted that unique souvenir of this crucial day in the history of our country, the D-Day dated war bond. At this hour, we cannot give you a complete summary of Connecticut's reaction to this first day of the invasion. We've about 3 more hours to go until midnight. And right now, all over the state, the buying is heavy in D-Day dated war bonds. Today, Connecticut has done much to lessen the worry of our troops abroad. Connecticut has proven it is with the troops. Connecticut is moving with the troops. And Connecticut will stay with the troops until the gallant men of General Eisenhower's army come home from the Great Crusade.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. From Hartford, Connecticut, we take you now to WSYR, Syracuse.
Reporting Central New York's reaction, here is Don Lyon.
With NBC's Central New York Invasion Headquarters at WSYR on the air since this morning at 12:43, when the first German announcement came through stating D-Day had begun, mothers, fathers, wives, brothers, and sisters of Syracuse and Central New York, men and women in service, have kept all telephone lines far busier than ever before, phoning in questions concerning the invasion. 2 of WSYR's top news analysts, Vanabone Kerr, just back from an assignment as a war correspondent in the South Pacific, and H.R. Eakins, former UP bureau manager in Rome and the Far East, have been on the air all day answering these questions. Perhaps the most often asked question, or one related to it, is one that we nor no one else, unfortunately, can answer. It showed better than anything else the tremendous tenseness and anxiety on the part of all those parents and wives who have men from this vicinity now in the invasion area. That question, summarized, was this: can you tell me whether or not the infantry, the ground crew, the signal corps, the ordnance department, in short, whether or not all services are involved in the invasion? Here, coming in over our telephone wires, we had the best cross-section of reaction on the part of Central New Yorkers that anyone could want. There was no gleeful shouting and cheering, or raucous screaming of sirens. Instead, throughout the city, all churches were open, most of them filled all day. And in the tears and the voices of men and women phoning this station, you can understand why there were no cheers. This was no occasion for celebration, but an occasion for worry. Is my son in this? How far behind the lines would my son, an airplane mechanic, be? Are the troops from Northern Ireland taking part in the invasion? My son is there. Question after question like these, headlines, Central New York's reaction. And then came the perfectly natural but impossible to answer questions relating to the length of time necessary to complete the invasion landing successfully. These were the more basic and sincerely thoughtful reactions of listeners to this NBC Invasion Headquarters station, WSYR in Syracuse. But a little more superficially and perhaps a little more colorfully, there were those usual reactions that one always finds in time of an emergency. Such things as being able to walk for blocks in the warm, early summer weather and hear through open windows of houses you passed an almost continuous flow of news from the various radios in those houses. In restaurants, people hurriedly grabbing breakfast or lunch, depending on how early they had awakened. At the same time, not tasting their food in the excited savoring of the news from their papers and loudspeakers. This was Syracuse today, D-Day, June 6, 1944. Not a different city from any of the others, but a city fully conscious of the seriousness of the mission undertaken and the time which must elapse before the final battle and victory.
From the studios of WSYR in Syracuse, New York, Don Lyon has brought you Central New York's reaction to the invasion. We take you now to WTAR Norfolk.
And from the studios of WTAR Norfolk, here's Blair Eubanks.
Weeks ago, plans were laid to notify the people of Norfolk that the invasion of Europe had begun by the blowing of police and fire apparatus sirens. However, even though the fire siren sounded at 3:55 a.m. for a full minute, most people in this vicinity were not awakened. It was not until normal early morning activities began that Norfolk residents, for the most part, realized that this was the long-awaited D-Day. Judging by the few windows lighted, thousands of persons did not know of the invasion until many hours after it was announced. But at about 8 o'clock this morning, small groups of people began to gather on street corners. From the looks of amazement on some faces, the news came as a great surprise. In Norfolk, great wartime seaport that it is, the Navy is always pronounced. Yet the 40 or 50,000 sailors who roamed the streets of Norfolk did not seem excited or surprised by the news of the invasion. Even though thousands of civilians in this area were uninformed, other thousands were kept right up to date on what was happening in Europe. These were the ones who were fortunate enough to have their radios tuned to WTAR. This station stayed on the air all night and relayed all the news. Overnight, a few Norfolk residents became experts. They not only listened to the radio, but carefully noted everything that was said. Therefore, when a question was asked, these embryonic news analysts would supply the answers. Here is an example. On the elevator this morning, there were a couple of ladies who didn't know anything about the invasion and said so in tones loud enough for everyone to hear. One of the fair but uninformed damsels happened to ask where the landings were made. Suddenly, a sleepy young man was galvanized into action and spoke up and gave one of the most learned discourses heard on or off the radio concerning the invasion. It was impressive, especially so before it dawned on me that it was almost word for word what Robert St. John had said some time before. The young lady was so impressed that she forgot to get off at the proper floor and consequently rode the elevator all the way to the top. She was not the only one who stayed on, however. I hung around to find out just how long it could go on. Apparently, the answer was indefinite. Because even though there were regular stops by the elevator, the young man kept right on talking. Before the young lady could get back to the proper floor, the embryonic news analyst had branched off into H.B. Kaltenborn and Elmer Peterson. When his feminine listener left the elevator, the young man looked quite dejected. Or maybe he was just plain sleepy. He had a right to be, for apparently he had stayed up all night listening to NBC. We take you now to WSPD in Toledo.
This is Jim Ubelhardt in the newsroom of NBC's affiliate station in Toledo. And the reaction to the invasion of those of us who have been helping to tell the story of today's stupendous operation is the weariness of body and the hoarseness of voice that will set in after many hours without sleep. Toledoans generally receive the news of the invasion in much the same way as the rest of the United States. That is, soberly and thoughtfully. There was relief evident everywhere here that the long-awaited development had finally come. But at the same time, there was anxiety and trepidation for the sons on the beachheads. WSPD was first here with the official news that D-Day had finally arrived at 3:32 this morning, after being on the alert since shortly after midnight. Our first action was to inform the major industrial plants of the news, makers of jeeps, guns, bullets, propellers, spark plugs. Their reaction was typically Midwestern. A few cheers, some expressions of concern, and back to the job of producing raw materials. No celebrations. Throughout the day, the churches of all faiths reported an increased number of worshipers. The Red Cross noticed an uptrend in blood donations and recorded an increase in inquiries to its Home Service Department regarding the status of servicemen overseas. There was a gratifying response to a new request for workers in the Surgical Dressings Department of the Red Cross. The Public Library and War Bond Headquarters added many new names to the list of volunteer canvassers for the 5th War Loan Drive. What about the reaction of Toledo servicemen? Well, frankly, I couldn't find one to ask. But I do have here with me a fellow broadcaster who was recently given a medical discharge from the Army just as he was about to sail from an embarkation port for invasion duty overseas. He is former Corporal Charlie Norman, who watched his outfit sail without him. Charlie, what's your reaction to today's invasion news?
Well, my first reaction is like a prospective bridegroom left at the altar. But seriously, I cannot help but feel that at a time like this, my place should be at the side of my buddies. And although I can't be with them, I know that they will take care of the job that I started but couldn't finish. Now, in keeping with that, I should like to say, good luck, fellas, and God be with you.
Thank you very much, Charlie Norman. Now we return you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
Back in the NBC newsroom in New York. Hartford, Connecticut, Syracuse, Norfolk, Virginia, and Toledo, Ohio. All their reactions appear to be the same. Grim determination to see this through. Later in this program, we're going to Cincinnati, to Memphis, Tennessee, to St. Paul, Minnesota, and Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And it'll be the same there. Maybe a little difference in the kind of weapons of war that are being made, but no difference in the men from these cities who will use all these weapons, and no difference in the prime thought of all sections, victory and liberation and lasting peace. Before we continue our cross-country swing, here are a few late bulletins. The German-controlled Paris radio has reported new Allied naval activity. The unconfirmed report says that a large squadron of British and of American ships is cruising off Cherbourg in France. The second communique from Supreme Allied Invasion Headquarters announces that our troops have succeeded in their initial landing and that the fighting continues. It confirms officially the fact that the invasion forces met only light opposition in the channel or in the air from the Luftwaffe. Here's a bulletin from Moscow. An indication that the Germans are weakening in their savage 8-day battle near Iasi in Romania was given by Moscow tonight. The Germans in the last few days have suffered heavy losses, and Tuesday brought into action comparatively smaller forces of tanks and infantry, the Moscow broadcast said. From London, a radio broadcasting service to provide entertainment as well as to keep invasion forces informed of developments on all war fronts will be started at 5:55 a.m. tomorrow, the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force announces. The program, to be called the AEF program, will be broadcast over one of the overseas services of the BBC. Judging from this, our troops in France are there to stay. And now to continue our cross-country swing of reactions to D-Day, we take you now to WLW Cincinnati.
Good evening. This is Arthur Riley of WLW in Cincinnati. This industrial stronghold, center of the machine tool industry of the United States, took D-Day outwardly in the same stride that has won her the title of Queen City. But deep down in her regal heart, she pulsated with pride. Pride in the fact that her matchless war production has done so much to make D-Day possible. Pride in the fact that her sons and daughters are playing active roles on all fronts, and particularly because many of her children are doing their part over there in the invasion area where history is being made at this moment. And pride in the fact, too, like so many of her sister cities, she is girding her loins now to back the attack in the forthcoming war moon, in which she once again will bear far more than her share of the common burden. Churches and synagogues here today saw a constant flow of worshipers of many faiths, each joining his or her prayer to the national supplication for divine aid and benediction for the men and women from this city and from all other cities who are engaged in this epical crusade of liberation. And there was a quiet confidence manifested by Cincinnatians as they went about their tasks. They didn't forget to do the things they usually do, such as donating their blood and giving all the other evidences of patriotism which residents of this city give day in and day out without fanfare or noisy demonstration. Tonight there is only one cloud on Cincinnati's D-Day horizon. A work stoppage in the central plant of the Wright Aeronautical Plant in nearby Lockland, Ohio, is temporarily halting production of engines for warplanes. But that is entirely an unauthorized or wildcat stoppage. Some stores closed for D-Day, some flags were flown, but on the whole, Cincinnatians were too busy doing their patriotic wartime jobs to give much outward manifestation of their deep and abiding love of country and of their unswerving faith in final victory. This is Arthur Riley taking you now to WMC, Memphis.
This is Bill Reed, WMC News Editor, speaking to you from down in Dixie. Memphis, Tennessee is headquarters for the American Second Army. General L.R. Friedendahl of the Second Army is a veteran of the African campaign. General Friedendahl was in command of the forces which captured Oran. He was later American Field General in Tunisia before assuming command of the Second Army. General Friedendahl speaks with authority on invasion. He says,
While it is too early to predict how our initial operations will develop, if a perfection with which they have been carried out thus far should be a source of pride to all of us in America. It is the beginning of the end for Germany.
Colonel Ron Waring, past National Commander of the American Legion, has this to say.
It's what we've known would be necessary since we entered the war. It's going to be costly, but it's absolutely necessary, and regardless of the cost, it must be carried through to complete and final victory. We must not permit a compromise nor a negotiated peace with Germany. Germany and Japan both must be decisively defeated in military combat.
Judge Camille Kelly, nationally known judge of the Memphis Juvenile Court, said,
"All day I have been receiving calls from Memphis mothers whose boys are over there. I have told them to read the 91st Psalm. It is my favorite, and it is a glorious invasion prayer. Our staff stopped for a silent prayer today, and we read the 91st Psalm together. 7 of our juvenile court staff members have boys in the service, and today was a day of tension for everyone. It was wonderful to hear our president climax his speech with a prayer last night, just before the signals were released by the Allied generals for that invasion for which we have all watched so long. This war will not be won altogether over there, but a big part of it is to be won on our knees over here. God protect our flag, save our boys, grant victory to the civilized world."
There are many, many anxious mothers in Memphis tonight awaiting further news of this momentous D-Day. Mrs. Mildred Hawkins, whose son is a lieutenant with the American Army in Britain, expressed, "I have known that it was bound to come, and I dreaded this since my son is on combat duty, and his wife is a nurse in England. I hope this will be the beginning of the end. This has been my prayer all day." This has been a day of prayer, hope, and anxiety in Memphis, a most natural reaction to the world's greatest military epoch. We take you now to KSTP, St. Paul.
This is Brooks Henderson speaking for KSTP, Minneapolis and St. Paul. The people in the north central states almost literally got down on their knees to receive the news of the Allied invasion of France. Ever since January 26th, 1942, the invasion of Europe and its necessarily horrible aspects have held the people of Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, North and South Dakota, and Nebraska in an emotional grip. On that day, remember, the first American troop convoy landed in Britain. It was composed largely of boys from these north central states. These states have also been heavily represented in each subsequent troop convoy to reach the British Isles. Just a few minutes ago, I talked to some of the people of Hutchinson, Minnesota, a small town of a few hundred. Hutchinson is the home of Milburn Hankey, who was the first American doughboy to walk down the gangplank when that troop convoy landed in Ireland back in January 1942. The people of Hutchinson are typical of all the people in the Midwest. They spent the day in work and prayer. Theirs were the intimate prayers of persons who know that the lives of their loved ones know rest, more than ever, in the hands of a compassionate God. Not only were churches devoted to religious services, but theaters and auditoriums also became centers of worship and petition. In Minneapolis, the Radio City Theater opened its doors for an impromptu, non-denominational service with Protestant, Jewish, and Catholic clergymen officiating jointly. Thousands attended. A similar meeting in the St. Paul Auditorium was just as well attended. Yes, the minds of the people in the Midwest were concentrated today on the news which everyone has expected not only for months, but since that day back in January 1942. And it wasn't altogether easy for them to concentrate. There were many distractions. The Red River, which runs along the borderline of Minnesota and North and South Dakota, threatened to overrun its banks and perhaps peril the wheat production of that area, which has long been regarded as the breadbasket of the world and which has accepted the task of supplying a large portion of the soldiers' food. It took the people of Tiope, Minnesota, less than an hour after hearing the invasion news to surpass their quota in the fifth war loan drive. And blood donor centers throughout these states reported donations of 40%. Communities throughout the Midwest area have been jumping the gun on the opening of the war loan drive. And at Plattsmouth, Nebraska, one war plant increased its production tremendously by the simple measure of installing radios so that employees could be kept abreast of the news. At Fremont, Nebraska, Dr. Charles McClellan led a mass prayer meeting. Dr. McClellan was well aware of the feeling of the men storming the beaches. He was chaplain for the invasion forces which swept ashore at Casablanca in North Africa.
Many of the smaller cities and communities and villages of these north-central states were ready to express their feelings over the invasion with a blowing of whistles and ringing of bells. Down in Lake City, Iowa, that was the plan, but it didn't go off as scheduled. The emotions were so deeply affected that no one remembered the bells and whistles. But on the Iron Range of Minnesota, they remembered, and by 3 o'clock in the morning, the folks of those cities were out in force. And they didn't celebrate, though, in the usual way. The men who mine that ore from the greatest open pit in the world decided, now that we're up, let's go to work. And they did. And that's the attitude of those miners is typical of the attitude of the people all over the north-central states for whom I'm reporting. We take you now to WKY, Oklahoma City.
Good evening, everyone. Oklahoma City's reaction to D-Day was one of patriotic and spiritual determination. War workers at the Douglas Aircraft Plant were thrilled to hear the news that Douglas C-47 transport planes dropped the first invasion troops in France. For hundreds of these transport craft have been built right here at Oklahoma City. But these war workers didn't take the day off to celebrate. They stayed on the job. They've been working 7 days a week in an effort to turn out 200 extra C-47 transport planes in the first 6 months of this year. So far, they have reached 91% of their production goal and 80% of the time allowed. But here's how D-Day really affected these Douglas war workers. They're in a bond campaign. Yesterday, they bought $30,000 in bonds, all cash. Today, however, $58,000 in cash was invested in bonds by the first shift of workers alone, and there are 3 shifts. Close by the Douglas Aircraft Plant is the Oklahoma City Air Service Command, the nation's model air depot. Tears mingled with excitement and an air of grim determination at the headquarters of the Air Service Command as the thousands of civilian employees reported for work on invasion morning. While these war workers are a long way from the actual battlefronts, they feel the pulse of war more keenly because bullet-scarred flying fortresses and flak-ridden liberators from the far-flung war theaters are flown to this air depot for repairs. And out there today in almost every office and hangar were workers who are directly touched by the long-awaited news. Many wives, mothers, fathers, and sweethearts of servicemen believed to be in the invasion army gave their reactions to the press. Their comment showed unmistakably how keenly the news of D-Day affected them. For example, Loretta Rummelhart, who works in the Ordnance Department, said, "I'm glad the invasion has started, although it makes me heartsick to know that it had to come. I think America will cut out foolish things, such as strikes, and really get down to business now." And then there is Colita Garrison in the Records Department. She declared, "The news just makes me want to work a little harder. I have 2 brothers who are taking part in the invasion, one with the field artillery and one with the infantry. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I did a little of both." Then there was the spiritual side of D-Day here in the Sooner State Capitol. At this very moment, the auditorium of one of the largest downtown churches is packed with men and women from all walks of life, gathered there to pray and be led in prayer by pastors of 5 large centrally located churches. There were other services, too, during the day in Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish houses of worship. And then there were the solemn words of Robert S. Kerr, Oklahoma's Sunday school teaching governor, who said, "Let us pray God unceasingly for our fighting men, for their success, and that he may be worthy of them." Dal Mooney speaking. We return you now to the NBC newsroom in New York.
Back in the NBC newsroom in New York, this then was the National Broadcasting Company's cross-country tour on D-Day, a program from every part of the nation to show what the nation was thinking and doing on this historic and momentous day. From Hartford, Connecticut to Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, the theme was the same: work and pray and fight. Meetings of gratitude were held, houses of worship were thronged. Here and there, sirens and whistles blew, but generally the reaction was one of deep emotion and grim determination. The National Broadcasting Company will remain on the air all night to bring you the latest invasion news as it happens. At 10 o'clock Eastern Wartime, the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, will speak to the nation. And at 10:15 this evening Eastern Wartime, over most of these stations, we'll present Bob Hope and Bing Crosby in a specially arranged program for Invasion Day. Keep tuned to NBC for full invasion news coverage. Ben Grauer speaking. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
A three-dimensional war machine has swept onto the continent of Europe. With NBC, invasion news takes precedence over all regular programs. In addition to special news broadcasts, bulletins will be brought to you as received. WEAF.
Ladies and gentlemen, Molly and I and our sponsor would like to say that we're mighty proud to be associated with the radio industry, which at this moment is fulfilling its promise of instant communication in time of world crisis.
The next half hour will be devoted to bringing you information immediately as received by NBC's news bureaus.
Between times, we will present songs of the services played and sung by Billy Mills Orchestra, the King's Men, and dedicated to our fighting forces on all fronts.
And now for music, and the news as it arrives, as Billy Mills gives us a George M. Cohan medley.